You guys want to talk about Lyman Wight, and I love talking about Lyman Wight. This is the largest paper I ever wrote at Texas A&M University in 2003, Preaching for Zion, a history of Lyman Wight, including an analysis of his theology. And at the bottom, I think this was supposed to be a 12-page paper. I write to Dr. Stadelman, who's the religious studies professor. I said, I was hoping to hand this to you in person. I got obsessed, but the theology section started on page 23. And so I wrote this 30-something page paper, probably the first full effort at scholarship that I accomplished. I was really into Lyman Wight. I first read about Lyman Wight from Mormon Hierarchy, Origins of Power, Michael Quinn's, in my opinion, my favorite book that he ever wrote. And at that time, we also had a family biography put out by Jeremy Benton White called A Wild Ram of the Mountains. I love Latter-day Saint family biographies because they often include visions to the author, like revelation on how to understand this person. And Jeremy gives us some of that. And I was really excited to one day write the masterpiece on Lyman Wight, because Jeremy Benton's book is very good, but theologically, he doesn't understand Nauvoo theology at all. But in 2006, my good friend, who later became my good friend, Melvin C. Johnson, wrote this excellent book, Polygamy on the Pedernales. Now, everybody should own a physical copy of this, but I'm going to tell you right now, you can get it free at Utah State University's online portal. They're big on making things available in a digital format. Awesome book. All right, so what can we learn about plural marriage from Lyman Wight? Lyman Wight is so interesting for a number of reasons. For me, he was so interesting because he didn't go with Brigham Young, and he emphasized the Council of 50 as his big claim. Now, if you don't know about the Council of 50, shame on you, but you can learn about it. And maybe I'll talk to you about that at some point, or send me a note if you're interested in it, and I'm happy to dig in. He was a member of the Quorum of 12 Apostles. 9 of the 12 apostles went west with Brigham Young, but 3 of them did not. This includes John E. Page, who would end up being a sort of briefly a straying-eyed. He was looking for a version of the faith that was really rooted in sort of 1830, the early form where the hierarchy hadn't yet developed in the same way. Those of you watching, they're Bickertonites maybe. Johnny Page would share a lot in common with you. There was also William Smith, who none of us, so far as I know, want to be associated with. He was a guy who went off and founded his own church, believed he was the most important apostle because he was also the patriarch. And then there was Lyman Wight. There's something about Lyman Wight that's just so powerful. Remember, all the apostles are gone at the time of Joseph Smith's death. I said all, but obviously John Taylor's in Nauvoo. But they're promoting his run for the presidency. And Lyman Wight is out there. I think his companion on this mission is Heber C. Kimball. Lyman was imprisoned with Joseph Smith in Liberty Jail. One of the things he mentions is that Joseph told him that it had been revealed to him that he wouldn't live past the age of 40. And you'll notice in section 122, where it says, your days are known and it will not be numbered less. Like, they're not going to kill you before it's your time. Calm down. And so Lyman Wight believes this is evidence that Joseph was inspired then too. So he is brought into the apostleship later in Nauvoo, I think in 1841 maybe. David Patton has been killed and there needs to be a replacement, and Lyman is that replacement. He is also on the temple committee in Nauvoo. He is sent to Wisconsin, to the Black River, to be in charge of the gathering of timber for the building of the Nauvoo house and the house of the Lord. And the story of what goes on in Black River in Wisconsin is fantastic. You can read a little bit of it in Mel's book. There's other writings on it today. And Melvin might even do more about it in John Hawley's book. I'm not sure. He has a biography of John Hawley as well. So they are separated from the rest of the 12 and the main body of the saints. They become a sort of people out there in Wisconsin, this group of Latter-day Saints who are excited in serving to build the temple. Lyman Wight and George Miller and others who are all together there. So the question is about plural marriage. I wrote an essay once, and I'm partly pulling from this research. It's in this fun book, The Persistence of Polygamy, put together by Craig Foster and Newell Bringhurst. My essay in it is called Nearly All the Factions. That's a quote from Joseph Smith III, who said, nearly all the factions are caught up in plural marriage. And I call it The Polygamous Passages of William Smith, Lyman Wight, and Alpheus Cutler. And so in my chapter, I go through each of these different individuals and talk about their experiences with plural marriage in their communities. So Lyman comes back to Nauvoo, as all the 12 do, and he works together with the 12. This is such an interesting quote that he's going to write, and it's worth sharing here. He says, he recalled finding the city of Nauvoo set in mourning for one of the most noble prophets of God since the world began, and the inhabitants thereof thrown into mass confusion by aspiring men. Who's he talking about? He's talking about Sidney Rigdon and William Marks, maybe, who sought the place of this noble man of God. Hence it called for the immediate action of the 12. The church, with the different branches around, were immediately called together by the 12, whereupon it was unanimously agreed that the 12 stand as the head of the church, with the exception of some few who fell victims to those aspirants and have gone to destruction. Lyman Wight was a friend of Brigham Young's in August, right? August 8th is the day that we had the big event, the showdown between Brigham Young and Sidney Rigdon. And it's determined that the 12 as a body, remember, not Brigham Young yet as a person, but the 12 as a body will preside over the church. They'll function as if they were the first presidency, something that's hinted at in section 107. They're equal in authority. Lyman Wight doesn't want to stick around Nauvoo. One, he's lost faith, I suspect, that the Nauvoo temple should be completed. And most importantly, he believes he's supposed to guide a colony to Texas. And so it's specifically the Black River Company, 150 of them or a little bit more, and they're going to go down to Texas together. And Brigham Young gives his blessing to that. It's an interesting story. I believe, and there's reasons to think this is true, that Brigham Young said to Lyman Wight, look, you bring your people down there, but I'm going to publicly say this isn't a great idea. And the reason I'm going to say that is because I don't want people abandoning the work in Nauvoo. And it leads to all sorts of struggles. Lyman Wight, even though he says that to Lyman Wight, and Lyman will later say that Brigham says this to him, Lyman feels betrayed when he leaves and he reads that people are calling him a coward for abandoning Nauvoo when he's trying to do what Joseph Smith asked him to do. So Lyman Wight first goes north, stays for a time again in Wisconsin. It's at that point that we know that plural marriage is being practiced in this community. Lyman marries 4 women, at least. Has his first child in plural marriage in 1845 in the fall or in the winter. And he is going to have within his community at least 4, maybe a few more, men practicing plural marriage, obviously more women. Our big question right now is Lyman Wight evidence that Joseph Smith was the person that introduced plural marriage? I don't think it's perfect. I think that individuals who hated Brigham Young were participating in plural marriage and not saying Brigham led us astray if it did originate with him is telling. I think that is a major thing we need to consider. Joseph F. Smith is collecting these affidavits. I'll talk to you more about that tomorrow when I review Michelle Stone and Cheryl Bruno's article. They're collecting these affidavits. And I agree with Michelle Stone and Cheryl that there is a goal to present a consistent history and certainly to answer questions that RLDS, the original polygamy skeptics, were bringing to the table. And these affidavits were supposed to answer them. The affidavit we have that tells us the most of this time period in this community, it's put together on February 27th, 1894 by Gideon Carter Jr. You can actually find Gideon Carter more prevalent in early church history in 1830. But Gideon Carter Jr. was 13 years old when the prophet dies. And so 1844, he's 13, but he claims he became aware of Lyman Wight having his first plural marriage in 1843. It becomes a conversation since the people in White's community after his death are going to break up. Some go to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and some go to the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And Wight really did think Joseph Smith III should be his father's successor in some way. And so people that emphasized that went over and stayed with Joseph Smith III, and those who often had plural marriage involvement went to Utah. And so this is an interesting individual, Gideon Carter. Our big sources are this Gideon Carter statement in 1894 and Orange Lysander Wight's autobiography. These are two retrospective accounts of what occurred in plural marriage in Texas. Again, our evidence for Wight is the claim from his community, at least by Gideon Carter, that it started in 1843, that a child is born later in 1845. George D. Smith is going to claim that he thinks it happened in May 1844, that Joseph Smith sealed Lyman to his first wives. I want to read to you part of Gideon Carter's statement. And this is not one of the typical Joseph F. Smith collected affidavits from earlier in the century. This is 1894. Importantly, Gideon Carter is not a Latter-day Saint of any shape by the time he records this affidavit. It's written in the handwriting of B.H. Roberts. It's really an interview. B.H. Roberts asked the question, and then he writes it, and they call it an affidavit instead of just like a journal entry, because it's going to be notarized at the end. Somebody had actually seen this take place and is a witness of it. All right, let me read you what is said about plural marriage by Gideon Carter. Remember, only 13 years old at the time of Joseph's death, and would have gone through his teens and early 20s in the White community. Here's a question from B.H. Roberts. Did Lyman Wight teach and practice plural marriage? Answer. He did. I remember that while he and his company were stopping at Prairie La Crosse in the fall and winter of 1844 to 1845, Lyman Wight's son, Orange L. Wight, who was the husband of my sister Matilda, married a plural wife, a young lady to whom he had been engaged before marrying my sister, but with whom he had broken through some misunderstanding. I understood that Lyman Wight performed the ceremony en route for Texas. One Jewel Miles married a plural wife, and Lyman Wight himself, before he arrived in Texas, also married a plural wife. And I remember distinctly that while living in Texas, he had 3 wives, and I think he had 4. Question by B.H. Roberts. Mr. Carter, did Lyman Wight say that Joseph Smith taught plural marriage? And did he practice it by virtue of the prophet Joseph Smith having instructed it? Answer. He did. He said that he saw and heard read the revelation establishing plural marriage before Joseph Smith's death. I've heard Lyman Wight relate many times how Joseph Smith announced the revelation to his brother. Hiram did not at first receive it with favor. His whole nature revolted against it. He said to Joseph that if he attempted to introduce the practice of that doctrine as a tenet of the church, it would break up the church and cost him his life. Joseph replied, "It is a commandment from God, brother Hiram, and if you don't believe it, If you will ask the Lord, he will make it known to you. The matter caused Hiram much distress and anguish at heart. He well nigh sweat blood over it. So repugnant was it to his feelings, and such his dread of seeing it introduced into the church. But he inquired of God according to Wight's statement, and he received from the Lord the same revelation that Joseph had, that it was a true doctrine and a commandment from God. That revelation was made known to some of the 12 before Joseph's death, and after it was read in one of the council meetings with some of the 12, Joseph bore testimony that it was of God, and that it was a principle wherein there was wisdom, truth, and virtue, and capable of bringing great good to the world. But owing to the sinfulness of men and their weakness, it would damn more than it would save. This is the explanation that Lyman Wight gave for the existence of polygamy in the branch of the church over which he held a jurisdiction. The explanation given to the younger members of his fellowship, who found no warrant for the practice in the Book of Mormon or in the Doctrine and Covenants. Lyman Wight also said that Joseph Smith had given him authority to perform these plural marriage ceremonies in connection with the ceremonies of the church. Mr. Wight, to meet the inquiries of some of his followers in a pamphlet that was gotten out, published what purported to be a copy of the revelation received by Joseph Smith in connection with plural marriage. There were many rules to be observed by those entering into these plural marriage relationships, which I do not find in the revelation published by the Mormons in Utah. There were things in that revelation that caused some dissatisfaction, and the pamphlets were withdrawn from circulation, and soon afterwards the practice of plural marriage in what may be called his branch of the church was discontinued. Mr. Wight gave as a reason for this step the prejudice of the world against it, and said the people were not pure enough to live up to that order of marriage. After this, there was no more plural marriages among his followers, though those who had already entered into that order maintained the wives they had taken. He says, B.H. Roberts asked, did Orange L. Wight marry your sister Rigula as his third wife? And Gideon Carter Jr. says he did in Gillespie County, Texas in 1849. And this was recorded in San Bernardino. I don't know Gideon Carter Jr.'s story. Why is he not a Latter-day Saint at the time he's telling this story? I think there's some important things to understand about affidavits. Absolutely, they are very clearly being recorded for a reason. It's a legal thing, maybe. In this case, it's a historical idea. We're trying to instances of Joseph Smith's practice as a plural marriage. There's some really cool claims here. I don't know if I believe it. One, that Wight published an actual pamphlet defending plural marriage. That seems a little risky to me. And it claims that Doctrine and Covenants 132 was part of that pamphlet, but that it continues on in the version they had. This is a fun idea. Doctrine and Covenants 132 ends with an interesting note. It says, verily I say unto you, I will reveal more unto you hereafter. Therefore let this suffice for the present. The Mormon fundamentalists who follow Joseph Musser have their own ending to D&C 132. And it's fun to think maybe Lyman Wight had as well. Fun in a scholarly way. We know there are these additional rules they are living by, which is largely Mosaic laws about purity and when one should abstain from having sex, and who one should marry. Guys, this is what's most exciting about Lyman Wight's teachings about marriage in general. First of all, he had the endowment, the Nauvoo endowment. Adam and Eve are the figures, and he focused on that endowment being about marriage. People called it an order of matrimony. That's important for us to have there, right? A guy who's only himself endowed in May 1844. I think it's May 12th, 1844. He's one of the last people endowed under Joseph Smith. And when he perpetuates it among his followers, marriage is the essential unit of that. And again, Wight is never part of the Nauvoo Temple experience, although he is going to be joined by George Miller, who was part of that experience. He's concerned about what he calls false doctrine concerning lineage and matrimony. Now, George Miller has several plural wives. That's not the issue. The issue is instead that Lyman Wight has taught that you can't just marry anyone. He believes in, you call it endogamy. That means you marry within a group. The group that he wants people to marry into is in their tribe. And so if you were a member of White's community, they have a patriarch who lays their hands on your head and will tell you what tribe you're part of. If you find out you're the tribe of Levi, you can only marry other people in the tribe of Levi. There's only one exception for the tribe of Ephraim. If you are the tribe of Ephraim, you can marry, of course this is a male thing, you can marry women from all the tribes, but he says you're going to have to place her back in her own tribe during the millennium, right? Whatever that means. Here is from the autobiography of John Hawley, who's later going to go on and become a member of the Reorganized Church. And Mel has written a great biography of John Hawley. Says, Lyman Wight had taught us in selecting a wife we should get one of our own tribe and lineage. Those believed to be descended from Ephraim, the highest lineage, could save any woman, whether they are this tribe or not. For said Lyman, this lineage could have a wife from every tribe, but in the resurrection, he would have to place her in her own tribe, but he would have power to visit her as a wife. It's interesting. There's never a situation where patriarch blessings have such a practical application in other versions of the Restoration, so far as I know. What a potentially controversial idea Brother Wight introduced among his people. This caused a lot of problems. We have a guy named David Clayton who is saying that Lyman Wight is trying to take his wife. So one of the questions is Lyman Wight actually saying to couples, oh, he's Levi and you're Ephraim, she's going to have to be married to someone else. We don't know any details of that happening except, in this case, David Clayton complaining about it. We also have a statement from Brigham Young where he says he's concerned about White's community in the wilderness because they're running into adultery. And so I don't know if this is a reference to that as well. So White's practice of plural marriage is pretty interesting. I think it's important to note that at some point Lyman Wight, just like Gideon Carter tells us, Lyman Wight ends the practice of plural marriage in his community. And the explanation he gives for it is really interesting. It's not that he doesn't believe in plural marriage. He believes the world's not ready for it. So I do think it's telling that Lyman Wight comes to hate Brigham Young. He talks about how Brigham is living among the Gadianton robbers. This is the place where Gadianton robbers lived in the West. That's why we have hot springs, that the lava of hell is heating it up. This is the quick and dirty story of Lyman Wight. Now, was plural marriage practiced publicly in Texas? I think this is an isolated community. It's a big deal. We see all the way from 1845 them warning that they didn't want women marrying the Gentiles. And we have sources from the Gentiles ticked off that these Latter-day Saints won't let them marry their girls or dance with their girls. Noah Smithwick, who writes our greatest account of Lyman's community, I think at the time they're around Austin, is going to say he never noticed plural marriage among them, and they did trade and stuff. However, there is a mention from one of the Whiteites themselves that one of the reasons they moved in the 1840s is because people had become aware of their plural marriage practices. Of course, if there was a pamphlet defending plural marriage, that would have been the time that they probably realized they should get rid of those. I really think Lyman Wight's pretty cool. When I was a youngster, when I was 22, it would have been like 2003, 2004, I put together this massive collection of all the sources on Lyman Wight I'd collected from the RLDS Church and from LDS archives. I think it's an important project. And I feel about Lyman Wight the same I feel about lots of people in other forms of the Restoration. These are great people. They're doing the best they know how with the light and knowledge they have. And that's what I'm doing too. So grateful for Lyman Wight. Does he prove plural marriage was instituted by Joseph Smith? He does not. Is it suggestive that He never says Brigham tried to get us to commit adultery. Maybe, but then again, he'd already invested himself into plural marriage. So I don't think he's the smoking gun. I think all put together, if so many different factions tied to Joseph Smith are practicing plural marriage, I think it should raise our eyebrows and say, maybe there's a common origin. And if they all don't turn on the apostles and say, these guys did it, well, then you probably need to think something else is going on. Like maybe they learned it from a source they take seriously.